welcome to another couching session that is offered to you by MSD Animal Health. And I am Rika Jolie. I'm the head of the global swine business at Merck Animal Health. This time, the couching session is from Brazil. We are at the IPVS in Rio. And it is with great pleasure that I can welcome Jack Bobo. We invited Jack here for this session because Jack is also a speaker here at the IPVS for us. And I'm going to ask Jack to introduce himself. So, Jack, tell me a little bit. Who's Jack Bobo?
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's an important conversation that's taking place, and I'm happy to be a part of it. As you said, Jack Bobo. My current title is Director of Global Food and Water Policy for the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization. But some of my background, I spent 13 years at the US Department of State, which is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, doing global food policy. So I spent time covering Africa, then Asia, then Europe. And during that time, I traveled to 50 or 60 countries talking about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate to the public. And these are just really important conversations to have, and you really need to engage people and listen to what their concerns are. And that was one of the things that I learned during my time at the State Department is listen more, talk less.
Okay. Yeah. Well, for me, it's actually a pleasure that I was asked to interview you because food is one of my passions. I love food. I love to cook. I believe food brings people together. But I don't think that we're going to be talking about cooking today. I think we're talking more about stories about food and how where are we at with food in the world? How can we sustain the planet with food for the future? So tell me a little bit about your interest in food and describe a little bit about what exactly are the topics that you study.
Yeah, so I do a lot of talks about the future of food, and in many ways there really is nothing we do that has a more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, but there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge we face is how to reduce the negatives and increase the benefits of agriculture. But I do think it's important to sort of start with that context. 40% of all the land on Earth is devoted to agriculture. So I think in terms of land, there's nothing more important. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So we certainly don't want that footprint to grow. In terms of water, 70% of all fresh water on the planet goes to agriculture. In the United States, the Colorado River no longer flows to the sea. So these are really serious challenges today. And then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 10 to 15% of emissions come from agriculture and another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is driven by agriculture. Mm-hmm. And so, that's sort of the challenge side of it. And those are real problems that we're facing today. But I think it's also important to recognize where we've come from. Agriculture today is wildly more efficient than it was, 30 years ago. If we were farming today with 1960s technology, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land, which is more than a quarter of all the forests on the planet. So we often see the deforestation, but we don't see the fact that, only because of advances in agriculture do the forests exist at all.
Right. But we do have some challenges, though, with the food supply. And we have changes in climate. How does that impact our food supply? We now have the issues with Ukraine, a big piece of where the grain comes from. So how do we approach that? So maybe start with the climate change. How does that impact our food supply in the future?
Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of impacts. I think we often think of the world getting hotter, but it's not just getting hotter. Some places are getting drier, some places are getting wetter, some are getting drier than wetter. If we look at what's happening in India today, just a couple of months ago, they thought, oh, we're going to be able to meet some of that demand for wheat because of problems that are happening in Ukraine and Russia. And then they had their own drought, and then they realized that they were going to end up being an importer of wheat. And now they're beginning to have floods. And so, those types of disruptions are going to become more common. And that means that we need to accelerate the pace of innovation and science in order to anticipate those future problems so that we can sort of future-proof our food system so that we can produce the food we need, but in a way that is better for both people and the planet. And the challenges are great. We're going from 7.5 to 9.5 or 10 billion people by 2050. That's, a 2 or 3 billion people increase. But not just that, those people, hopefully their incomes are rising, right? And so it's not just, 50% more food, but it could be 100% more animal protein, because the first thing people ask for when their incomes increase is more animal protein because of the nutritional benefits.
So some of these events are unpredictable. Yeah. Can we respond fast enough though? Are we prepared for that?
Well, they're unpredictable sort of in the specific, what's going to happen next week or next month. But I think we can definitely see the longer term trends. The western part of the United States, where much of the produce comes from, is in the midst of a 1,200-year mega drought. Things are just going to get drier. We know that in general, and we should be anticipating that. And so, over the last couple of years, I've worked with a couple of different governments thinking about their food security for the future. And so some of the things that we talked about was diversifying their source of food. So yes, maybe it's cheaper to get it all from Ukraine, but maybe you want to have a more diverse supply chain so that when a crisis occurs, whether that's geopolitical or climate, you're prepared for it. And so we can begin to think about, that diversification of supply, diversification of production, stockpiling certain products that, they're amenable to that. So there are a number of things we can do, but also, just making sure that our crops and, the technologies are prepared for those changes as well.
Now, you said you took on a position with the Nature Conservancy. What exactly does the Nature Conservancy do? Where do they come in play here with all this?
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy is the world's largest conservation organization. They work in 76 countries around the world, but it really started in the United States back in 1951. And I think, when many farmers and ranchers think about conservation groups, they think about groups that are sort of going to beat up on them for what they do. But the Nature Conservancy has always been about working directly with farmers and ranchers to help them improve their own farms, with the recognition that if it's not economically viable, it's not viable. And so that's one of the things that attracted me to them, is that they're very focused on the science. Let's figure out what we can do to make the operation better and improve the environmental outcomes. I think that what's also interesting is I spent time with the UN food agencies a few months ago, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Program, EFAD, and others. And all of those organizations are thinking about, well, we do food, but how can we do it better in terms of conservation? And as a conservation organization, we're thinking about how can we make food better? And so we're moving towards the same place. And if we can work together, maybe we can get to that place faster. And so I see that there's this real opportunity right now. And sort of maybe the final point with the Nature Conservancy is that there's this recognition that you can't build walls high enough to keep hungry people out of the forest, nor should you. If people are sustainably and nutritiously fed, then they don't cut down forests. They don't, do the things we don't want them to do. And so by ensuring that people are taken care of, we're actually ensuring that our natural environment is there for consumers, but also for the producers themselves. That resilience is, good for the long-term viability of their operation.
All right. I want to switch topics a little bit, and protein. We all need protein, and we're so used to animal protein, but we hear more and more about those alternate proteins, the meat in a lab. What are your thoughts on that? Where does that fit in the big scheme of things here?
Yeah, well, we already mentioned that we need as much as 100% more protein by 2050. And we probably shouldn't do that by just doubling the amount of, animals that we're using to produce food on the planet. The footprint of that would be enormous, and it would probably be negative. But I think there's a concern that, the alternative proteins are going to drive some of the producers out of business. And I don't think that's very realistic, because today animal protein is a $2 trillion global industry. And by 2050, it could be a $3 to $4 trillion opportunity. Well, the alternative protein business is not going to scale to a $2 trillion opportunity in 30 years. The reason, there are a lot of reasons, but one is just the cost of infrastructure. Building one of these facilities could cost $100 or $200 million, and you would need thousands of them, to do it. And so, the question isn't, will they replace the traditional animal protein? The question is, how much of the future market will they capture?
Right. Okay.
And so, and my guess is they will capture some of it, and that's good because that will, as traditional agriculture gets better, the footprint will get smaller, and then they can help to make up that gap in where we need to be without expanding the footprint.
So it may be more a picture of like there's room for everybody. There will be room for the traditional protein and also the alternative.
Yeah, and we think about whether if you're producing pork today, you may compete with the beef folks or the poultry, but you're not trying to drive them out of business, right? And hopefully in the future we come to see friendly competition between sources of protein as just the way business works, and consumers will sometimes want one or they'll want the other, and part of it is just reducing that tension between the different players. I always say that sort of my personal mission is to de-escalate the tension in our food system so that we can all get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. And if we all do better every day, then I think we will get there. Okay.
So Jack, we're at a swine conference, so we have to talk pigs a little bit. So what is it that we can do better as an industry? What is it that we need to share with our producers here, how they can help us sustain in the future with respect to food?
Well, part of it is, telling our story better, or telling your story better. That, consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And if they don't really appreciate it, the things they ask industry to do may or may not accomplish their goal. So they say they want, a more sustainable product, but the one they ask for may or may not actually be more sustainable. And so we need to be able to communicate better what it is we're doing. We also need to reduce some of that tension that I was talking about. I mean, there's this feeling that if one part of the sector attacks you, then you need to attack them back. And if alternative protein, or a plant-based burger is coming after us, then let's go after them for having 50 different ingredients. And that may feel good, but it also ultimately undermines consumer confidence in food. People are stressed all the time about what they should eat and how much they should eat, and it's never been more complicated for consumers to make good choices. And food shouldn't be that hard. Nutrition shouldn't be that complicated. And so I think, greater transparency, greater engagement, and more about the stories. And I think there, swine and pork products are actually really well positioned because I think about pork as being sort of very unique among the animal proteins. Because when I think about a steak, well, I'm thinking beef. When I think about hamburger, I'm thinking beef. But when I think about a pork chop versus bacon versus ham, I think about the product first. And so, there's much more of a cultural connection to the individual products of swine than I think with any other animal product. And so I think that's an interesting space to lean into, that cultural connection between the food and, consumers' feelings about it.
Okay. So we hear a lot about, and you touched upon it already, we hear a lot about transparency and traceability. And so I'm a shopper. I go to the grocery store, I stand in front of the meat case, and I also look a little bit at others on, how do they approach that meat case? And I often wonder, do these people really think much about where their meat comes from? Do you think that that's a general public concern, or is it just a small portion of the general public that is really interested in knowing where their food comes from? And how does that then impact the larger population?
Well, I think it's a smaller portion. If you look at things like nutrition labeling, most people say they read labels, but when you actually do studies to sort of track the eye movement, turns out most of them don't. What we want to do and what we do aren't always the same. But I do think it matters that there is a small percentage of consumers who are very actively interested in those topics, because over time, more and more investors are going to care, how food is produced, the sustainability metrics. Governments are going to become more engaged in these conversations, and so it's a signal of where the market is going. And I think that producers would be wise to be taking advantage of that knowledge about where the industry is going, because you want to get to where the consumer is going before they get there. You don't want to be racing to catch up. And if swine are behind beef or poultry in the story they're telling, then that's going to be, bad for them.
Right. Okay. I believe another topic that is of interest to you is food waste. And I mean, before we started talking here, I shared with you a little survey that I read recently on how consumers waste a lot of meat by, and it was almost, the statistic was fairly large, where people buy meat and then they waste it because they don't, either eat it fast enough or they don't freeze it. Now, that to me, I don't understand that because I don't think that way. So tell me a little bit about food waste and what is it that we can do better with that?
Right. So, I think, many people feel like food waste is this great opportunity because a third of food is wasted pre-consumer in the developing world and post-consumer in the developed world. But it is challenging because food waste is not one problem, it's 1,000 problems. If we're talking meat, it's different than potatoes, it's different from bread, it's different from apples. But if we can reduce it, that would have a really big impact. Just informing people that they shouldn't waste food isn't a very effective, unfortunately, because nobody really wants to waste food. And so we need to understand, like, how does it happen? And so a lot of the challenge we have in food really come down to consumer psychology and behavior. And so how can we change that behavior so that people save money, they don't waste as much food, and then that food is available for other people. So it's not about just reducing it, but increasing availability. And I think that requires us to do more research into how it's actually happening in individual homes. Is it, they're cooking it and then wasting it, or they're not remembering to cook it, or they're throwing it out because, you've got a Best By label on the food. It's perfectly safe, but they're misunderstanding labeling, and that's leading them to make decisions.
So it's not as simple as education. It may be a lot more of a psychological, change the psychology of people, or?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a knowledge issue at all.
Yeah.
Again, I think, people don't want to do it, and they're doing it because they're making some sort of a mistake. And if you make consistent mistakes, that's a bias. And so, we have to figure out how to shape those behavioral tendencies.
Okay, all right. So maybe a personal question. How do you approach food? Because obviously you know a lot about food, where it comes from, and you have certain thoughts about how we can do better with growing food, and so how do you approach food?
Well, I try to approach food from a position of joy. I feel like food should bring us happiness. It should not be a source of stress in our lives. And I think way too many people are stressing about food every day. And so when I'm preparing food or going out for food, I want it to be something that's, I feel good about. And, when I think about, the food on my plate, I don't want to have to count calories. I don't want to have to worry about portion sizes and things like that. So, part of what I'm doing is, if I'm cooking vegetables that taste great, then I can have a plate that's more full of them. If I have a plate that's the right size, then I don't have to worry about over consuming. And so if you structure your food environment in the right way, it actually works for you instead of against you. Back in 1960, the average dinner plate in the United States was 7 or 9 inches, which is like a salad plate today.
Okay.
And the average plate today is about 12 inches.
Oh, wow.
So if you put 30-40% more food on a plate, you're going to eat more. And so if you just eat off smaller plates, you can address that. So my approach is to structure the environment so I don't have to think about things because I'm lazy, we're all lazy, and we're very easily manipulated by our environment.
Okay.
And so let's let it work for us instead of against us.
Okay. So we shouldn't worry so much.
Shouldn't worry so much if you can structure your environment to help you. If you have a tendency to eat all the cookies, well, maybe you shouldn't buy the cookies. If you buy the cookies anyway, maybe you put them in the cupboard, or you put them in a cookie jar that's opaque and not transparent. Like, there are little nudges you can do to affect your everyday behavior that aren't about denying yourself joy, but they're about, reducing your tendency to, take advantage of that. Okay. And a lot of our overconsumption these days is just boredom. People walk into a kitchen and they're like, maybe I'm hungry. Well, maybe you're just bored. You don't want to be working, and so you go into the kitchen to distract yourself. And maybe if we would read a book or go for a walk, we wouldn't eat overconsume, and we might actually be a little healthier.
Yeah, I guess the last couple of years haven't helped a lot of people working from home and snacking their way through the day. You know,
Right.
so, what else do you think we should know about the future of food and how we can help influence this?
Well, one is I think people should be optimistic about it. Things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. And so instead of blaming farmers and producers for not creating a sustainable environment, let's see what we can do to get them to that more sustainable future even faster. And so reframing our conversation is critical. And another point would be in terms of the language we use. So as a conservation group, we should stop telling farmers what they should do and start talking about what they could do. And that's an opportunity. And so language, has a really big impact on how people think about, the conversation.
Okay. Well, I think we're sort of at the end of our couching session, and I think it's been very enjoyable and very educational to learn sort of other aspects of food. So I'm surely going to think a little differently about everything. So Jack, it was a pleasure to be here with you today on this couch, and looking forward to keeping in touch in the future maybe, and hear more about your adventures with food. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.